A single step beyond the limits of the Constitution really should be seen by all of us who support the Constitution and liberty as a step too far because it sets the precedent for more and more in the future. But yet we find a lot of people today, even people who do say they support the Constitution and liberty, think it's okay to not just kind of turn a blind eye to something, but even to actively support something as what they call the least offensive option, even if they realize that all the options violate the Constitution. This is a fatal error. And that's what John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, told us. Plus, we had very similar arguments from people like Thomas Jefferson, James Otis Jr., and a bunch of others. Lots of warnings. More on that in a moment. First of all, welcome and thank you so much for being here and joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, April 8th, 2024. Let's get right to this. If I can pull my notes up, I want to start out with James Otis Jr., and here he is writing as a free-born American in April of 1767. He said, "A free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years." He recognized that any system that any people had ever set up at any time throughout history doesn't go from freedom to tyranny. We all understand that it's the nature of government to grow. St. George Tucker in 1803 pointed out that all governments have a tendency towards increase. All the founding generation certainly understood this. The old revolutionaries understood that governments tend to grow over time. But James Otis Jr. is pointing out you don't go from, a land of the free or even some form of relative freedom to total tyranny in one fell swoop. That just doesn't happen. There's a lot of steps that are set as precedent to build upon that. And each one gets built into another and another and another. So all the founders in the old revolutionaries absolutely recognize that you don't get from freedom to tyranny in one step. For example, John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution. This is a story that he told in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. If you want to understand the principles of the Revolution, when we talk about the Revolution, we're not talking about the war for independence. That was an outgrowth. The Revolution was from around 1760, 1761 through 1775 when the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. It was the radical change in the viewpoints of the people, a new understanding, a concept of sovereignty, of final authority, all power flows from the people and the like. But if you want to understand how the vast majority of people understood things at the time, you gotta read John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written in response to the Townshend Acts in 1767, published in late 1767 and throughout 1768. These were the most widely read documents on American liberty throughout the Revolution, up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when the fighting was already going in 1776. And here's an example that he gave that I've cited many times in his 9th letter, talking about how Spain was once free, as he put it. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. None. One of their kings, though, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed, and Dickinson put some highlights here, all caps and bold and italics. This isn't something that's new in email forwards today. Dickinson used this pretty regularly. Here, some caps, but here he highlighted that he might be allowed for that emergency only. And that was what he's really emphasizing. The people in Spain were sold on the idea that, well, it's a war, it's an emergency. I know there's a limit on whether or not we can raise money outside the rule on how we raise the money in order so, you don't have one dude making the decision of how all the money's going to go. And that check on power was, the king asked, in this emergency only, can we raise more money without assembling the Cortes, the parliament? The request, Dickinson writes, was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, just like we see so many times today, opposition to mass warrantless surveillance, to the Patriot Act, and so many other things are just used for one emergency. And then over time, people learn, well, wait a second, I thought this was just going to be for this. How is it expanded to everything else? We see this in almost everything that government does. Those are just some big examples. And Dickinson points out that it was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession, one time during a war as an emergency to allow him to raise money without following the rules, he said, was a precedent. And he put all caps on precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So it went from the king could only get money with approval of the representatives of the people. Then it went to, well, we just have one emergency. And then from each precedent, you build upon that. That's what government does. And eventually, it wasn't just in emergency situations. The king eventually ended up with a general power to raise money whenever the king decided it was necessary. Very similar to how, well, maybe they've twisted, I'm just thinking of this as I'm talking through it, maybe it's similar to how government treats the necessary and proper clause, even though there is a very specific legal doctrine, a doctrine of principles and incidents. It has ended up, as many of the anti-federalists warned, that government would determine what government decides what's necessary for government to do. And when you give government that power, you shouldn't be surprised when that government always grows, no matter who's there. So Dickinson warned that this one single concession, even in a time of war, was a precedent. And he said from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful and the people ceased to be free. And like he did at the end of this letter, number 9, he had a very important Latin phrase, well-read dude. I can't read it in Latin. He said, oppose a disease at its beginning. This is very similar to what James Otis Jr. had used, John Adams had used, another phrase called obsta principiis, which is nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. This is what the founders and old revolutionaries really thought was incredibly important. Now, Dickinson took the same approach in response to the Stamp Act in 1765, and he was discussing the Stamp Act in 1767 still, because some people were saying, oh, this is just kind of a small thing. I'll get to that in a moment. This is the least offensive thing. Why should we stick our necks out? And he is pointing out that the Stamp Act was a precedent, and we opposed it because of the precedent at the time. And at the time, he published a broadside urging people to refuse to comply with it. Why? And in his words, he said, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. He pointed out you voluntarily do this too. So by complying with something that they're not authorized to do, even if you think it's a small thing that they're not supposed to do, you are establishing the chains that will bind you for all time. Now, unfortunately, most people don't take this attitude today, but he went a little further. He said, you voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. Again, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. Voluntarily, you just give in and give them the power. Government's going to try to do stuff that they're not authorized to do. If we don't recognize that all governments do this, then we're being pretty dumb. This is a very dangerous approach. If we recognize that what governments do, which is grow and violate liberty and take your money and, well, counterfeit and all kinds of bad stuff, if we allow them to take a single step, why should we be surprised when they take another step? He said, power is of a tenacious nature. What it seizes, it will retain. And he was responding to the point that some people say, well, no huge deal. It's not a huge deal. It's okay because it's a small thing and we'll get it repealed later. And he's pointing out, no. Whatever government takes, they don't give up. And he put it this way. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. So most people don't have this attitude today. I think very few people, including people who are on the side of the Constitution and liberty. None of us here, of course, we know that it's all bad and we never actively support the lesser of two evils, right? So, but anyways, I want to get to why this kind of train of thought. There was a post on X from someone who is very friendly to our goals that I want to share. But the background here comes from an article by Raul Lopez over at Knox News. He writes, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, enacted, I think this was in 2022, included $65 billion to get the internet infrastructure where it is needed and to make sure people can pay for broadband access when it is available. This is a socialist redistribution program. It's a welfare program to address that's my take. That's not what Raul says. He loves this thing. To address the affordability issue in particular, the Affordable Connectivity Program provides $14 billion for households with limited income, mostly in the form of a discount of up to $30 a month for internet service. I mean, I guess I just want to throw it out there. If government really wants to help people be able to afford stuff better, maybe they should stop counterfeiting. The more that they flood the market with money, the less value that it has, this fiat paper garbage. And the more that they spend in Congress, the more money that it creates a cycle, the more that they're going to print. So every time they do a wealth redistribution thing or a handout or a welfare program, the more that they hand out checks to keep people sitting at home during a health emergency or during anything, the more, or to pay for internet broadband, the more that government does this, the more that it feeds the beast, the more that it feeds the cycle. So I just wanted to add that. So I do agree that more people having access to better internet is awesome. I am lucky enough to at least be close enough to middle class where I can live in a place where I have very good internet and I can communicate with you. I am very lucky to that. I know many people do not, and they're still suffering with really crappy service. But doing so with an unconstitutional socialist welfare program like this is not the way to get it done. Now, of course, some people, as an aside, think that the general welfare clause does authorize federal welfare programs targeted to specific groups of people like this, but they couldn't be more wrong. Here, for example, I just wanted to touch on general welfare a little bit here. It's important. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to Albert Gallatin in June of 1817, this, mind you, I think this was actually discussing a veto by James Madison on an infrastructure spending bill, one that he said he was personally in favor of the goals of, but that he could not find power under the General Welfare Clause or any other place in the Constitution to actually authorize it. So they passed it, sent it to his desk, and he said, no, I mean, I like this, it's my last day in office. I'm just trying to think if this is the right letter that I'm referencing here, but he did do this. Madison, on his very last day in office, specifically vetoed an infrastructure spending bill. Because it wasn't under the power of general welfare. Anyways, here's how Thomas Jefferson described it to Gallatin. He said, our tenet ever was that Congress had not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but were restrained to those specifically enumerated. The people who ratified the Constitution did so under the understanding, as Thomas Jefferson is telling us, that the General Welfare Clause allowed them to have power to basically tax and spend to effectuate the delegated powers that were specifically enumerated, not for just whatever, not just any time they saw people having difficulty, they could just hand them money. That's a charity program. I'll get to Madison on that in a moment. And here's how Jefferson continued. He said, in that, as it was never meant they should provide for that welfare, but by the exercise of the enumerated powers, so it could not have been meant they should raise money for purposes which the enumeration did not place under their action. I'm looking at the enumerated powers on a pretty regular basis. I think we should all read the Constitution at least once in a while. But I don't find anything in the expressly delegated powers that discusses paying for broadband access for people who can't afford it. And of course, I don't want to get too deep into general welfare. The idea of general welfare was it's a tough one for a lot of people to understand. Even Jefferson, when it was proposed in the Articles of Confederation, the term general welfare, he wasn't a fan of it because it wasn't easily understood. Some people would see it as poorly defined. But the legal doctrine that we're talking about here is that if it's general welfare, it has to apply to everyone. It doesn't just provide a benefit or help to a select group of people, whether it's based on race or age or gender or location. None of that is supposed to happen. That's not authorized. That is up to each state to determine, the people of each state to determine if they want to use their tax money in that way, not for the general government. So Jefferson's pointing out that it has to be in support of the delegated powers. James Madison had the exact same view, the so-called father of the Constitution. I think that's an overstatement, but here he is in a letter to James Robertson Jr. He put it this way: with respect to the two words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of powers connected with them. So anyway, there's been some debate over how that stolen money, that infrastructure spending money, is going to be spent. Some people actually are saying, well, if you want to advance broadband access, better internet access for people, you should just give the money to the states. And then some people on the state level are saying, well, the state should kind of own the infrastructure there. And then others are saying, well, we don't want more government control. We just want the money to go directly to the people, as if somehow that is a government control. But here's this is a very common take that I'm seeing from people who tend to be on the side of the Constitution and liberty, or who are generally on the side of the Constitution and liberty. I think this is a very fatal error on their part. And this was posted on X recently. I'm not including the person as well, because I think they're very good on many issues. I don't really want to call them out, but the message, I think, is what's important to discuss. To be clear, they write, I don't want the government funding much of anything. I'm with you there. But for some reason, they decide that even though they don't want the government funding much of anything, you got to take what you got. Infrastructure spending, they write, is least offensive to me in the mix, though. And regardless of my stances, the government already allocated the funding for internet expansion. So if they've already allocated, it's already been stolen, I'm already opposed to it, I guess I could at least work to advocate the way that they spend the money. And so just give it directly to people. And that's really the argument that we're seeing over this particular thing. I think that's the type of argument we see on all kinds of things. Now, setting aside the fact that government and supporters of the government, supporters of the monster state, they absolutely love it when you put all your time and energy into debating other people about how they should use money that they should never be using in the first place. They like that because it is a total distraction. Whether it's the best way or the least bad way for them to spend money that they've stolen. Now, thinking it's okay to support an unconstitutional act because it's the least offensive is, as I mentioned right at the outset, and what John Dickinson called a fatal error. Not just a bad strategy, but fatal. I'll get to more of that in just a moment. But first of all, I do want to point out that everything that I'm citing in this episode, the original source documents, I've got a couple of other things here as well. They will all be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley organizes the blog posts for every episode, and I get them published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. And there again, you'll find a show links section plus all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like LinkedIn and YouTube and X and Facebook and Twitch. We also live stream over at Odyssey.com. Got a lot of great feedback. The most thoughtful comments sometimes I see come over from a small group of people over on Odyssey, and then also on Rumble and YouTube. A lot of great feedback. I appreciate all of you. We don't get as much interaction on Meta and Facebook as much lately. I think a lot of people are moving to other platforms. But anyways, while I'm here, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I want to take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys being here, and I finally got a chance. I'm trying to figure out how to get Rumble in the mix here, but I want to say hi to everyone out there as well. Mr. Adams, Gypsy Magic, Dennis Marburger, good to see you. Render Under Seizure, and everyone else over on Rumble. There's also in the other platforms, Senator DT, Kirk Morrison, Richard Banks, Salt Lakers, Melody over on YouTube and elsewhere. I know I'm missing a few people. Dave and Sonny on Facebook. R.C. Andrews, good to see you, buddy. Senator DT, Deborah, Zahar, the proprietor. I appreciate you guys all being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Anyways, let's get back to this as soon as I can get my notes pulled back up because I switched over to Rumble. But I wanted to give you guys some love on all these different platforms. Thank you, whether you watch live or in the archive, or you listen on the podcast edition. All that stuff is pretty awesome to me. So we're talking about how this is a fatal error. Now let's get back to John Dickinson. And here's how he put it. He's describing the Townsend Acts, and he's responding to the notion that, well, should we go out there and do what we did in response to the Stamp Act? Because, well, this isn't nearly as bad. It's not as offensive. The duties are pretty small. Well, that's a lot of risk for just very little. And this is how Dickinson put it. Again, the most widely read documents on American liberty throughout the Revolution. Some persons may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. A fatal error. That is the very circumstance most alarming to me. So to the penman of the American Revolution, The most dangerous situation was not a huge convulsion, not a huge step towards tyranny, because he understood, just like James Otis Jr., who I cited right at the beginning, he understood that governments take small steps and they continue growing. And by the time you look back on it, you're like, whoa, how did things get so crazy here? Every bad thing that the dude in power today does is a building upon powers that were left to them by previous bad dudes. And they're all terrible. Don't fool yourself, because if they're not actively opposing everything that violates the Constitution, they are all violating their oath. Side note. Some persons think this is of no consequence because it's small, a fatal error. That is the very circumstance most alarming to me. For I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. It's always about precedent. To console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us, praising the neatness of the workmanship. So it's a trap. Every time they convince you or they set up a scenario where you're debating over which option is less bad, whether it's a policy or a bum, every time they're doing this, this is a trap. And to console yourselves with the idea that you're supporting the lesser of two evils or the smallness of the scam of the welfare program is to, as John Dickinson put it, walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us. Oh, wow, nice job setting that up for us, guys. It doesn't look as bad as it could be, so I'll stick my neck into it, bend over, and take whatever you're going to give me. Now, almost 25 years later, Thomas Jefferson, who worked with Dickinson on many things throughout the years up until the War for Independence, for example, he and Dickinson in 1775 wrote one of the most important documents during the War for Independence, the Declaration of why they were fighting. So the Declaration of Causes of, I'm screwing up the name, but they wrote that their attachment to no nation on earth should supplant their attachment to liberty. So as soon as they start going after your liberty, it doesn't matter who's doing it. You don't support it. But anyways, that's a quick side note. But here's how Jefferson put it in his response to the National Bank proposal from Alexander Hamilton in 1791. He said, the tiniest usurpation of power is really a precedent for everything else. Just like Dickinson said in 1767, just like James Otis Jr. warned in that same year. So it's going to expand. And he said it this way: to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible to any definition. So one single step, even if you think it's a small one, is giving them unlimited power. Because if there are limits, and the limits mean, well, we can do what we want when we want to, eventually there are even the paper limits have no meaning at all. And that was Jefferson's warning. So despite this, we do have supporters of the Constitution and liberty just falling for the trap. Here's another one. We aren't fans of our taxes being used, but getting the internet out to more people is probably the least worst use for it. So supporting, they're tricking good people into falling for this trap, falling for the snare that was set for us, getting us to take sides on things that they were never supposed to do. Option A, they aren't supposed to do. Option B, they're not supposed to do. So if you throw your support behind option B, A, maybe someone in the future might do A and B. And that's generally how it plays out. So this person says, again, this was an interaction in that same thread. Getting the internet out to more people is probably the least worst use for it. Now, is it? I guess there could actually be an argument to be made on this. And just thinking out loud here, you know, sometimes direct subsidies not only set the precedent for more direct subsidies, and then you'll end up with option A and option B in the future, but it also creates a direct dependency by the individuals who are getting the subsidies. As we can see in various socialist programs, those are very, very hard to get rid of, because as people become more reliant on government to pay for anything, any effort to remove that guarantees that the people trying to run for office, they can't ever even mention it. They are unmentionable programs, so many of them. on the federal and state and local level. So it creates a dependency. And then maybe in the long run, this type of thing is worse. I don't know, but I think there's some consideration that has to be given to the idea that, well, handing money to a state government and actively supporting the state government, then handing the money directly to people creates maybe a worse situation. I don't know for sure. Either one is pretty bad. And ultimately, charity is not what the federal government is authorized to be doing. And that's how James Madison put it in a speech in the House of Representatives discussing a charity situation for an emergency for people who were really needing help. He said, "Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government." He even recognized that these people needed help and he wanted to help them, but it wasn't up for him in the House of Representatives. He's saying it's not up to us to actually do that. And he went further with this. He said, these are from the notes, January 10th, 1794. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that done, and we'll get it published at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty so you could read it in context on your own time. Mr. Madison wished to relieve the sufferers, these Santo Domingan refugees, but he was afraid of establishing a dangerous precedent. Again, handing out money to help people sounds good on the surface. And in fact, of all the things that government might do, our compassion as human beings, I think what they do, I think what these psychopaths and sociopaths who are willing to rip people off and scam, all the corruption, plunder, and waste, as Thomas Jefferson described a consolidated government, I think they like to prey on the fact that the rest of humans have empathy and they care for the well-being of others. So if it's going to be a choice between, well, funding some dictator overseas or taking some money and giving it to people who truly are needy and we can see that they need some help, well, most people are going to be like, well, okay, I get that. But that is the trap. They trick us into doing this and they keep having more power to do more and more and more. James Madison thought this would establish a dangerous precedent, which might hereafter be perverted to the countenance of purposes very different from those of charity. When you give them the power to hand out things to people in the first place, to anybody that they're not authorized to do under the Constitution, people are going to find different ways to do this. That's just like what Dickinson pointed out in 1767. If you have one emergency during a wartime, eventually, that's not just a one-time deal. That one-time deal becomes, well, whatever they think is necessary. Madison acknowledged for his own part that he could not undertake to lay his finger on that article in the federal Constitution, which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government, is how I put it earlier. Maybe it was after this. And if once they broke the line laid down before them for the direction of their conduct, it was impossible to say to what lengths they might go or to what extremities this practice might be carried. And that's what we live under today. Once you break the line of the rules, just like Thomas Jefferson pointed out, the line is broken, they have unlimited power. And eventually the only way to get it back is for people to stand firm on the line of the rules, because every single time you allow them to do stuff that they're not authorized to do. And it's not just about like, okay, they've got so many things that they're doing, it's impossible to actively oppose all of them, but actively supporting something just because it's the least bad is the same as actively supporting someone having additional power to do other things in the future because you've given them that dangerous precedent. Here's Dickinson again from his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. He kept hammering home on this idea. Here he is in letter number 10. Some persons may imagine the sums to be raised by it are but small, and therefore may be inclined to acquiesce under it. Now remember, in response to the Stamp Act, he said if you comply with it, you voluntarily establish the detestable precedent. You put the chains around yourself. And so many people, because it doesn't seem like a big deal, are either okay with acquiescing. Now, he's not even addressing the people who are actively supporting it. He's just saying, okay, for those of you who think this is bad, don't submit. Now we have another level of that. It's not just submission, it's active support of something because it's least bad. The lesser of two evils is the way to go. A conduct more dangerous to freedom, as before has been observed, can never be adopted. To John Dickinson, the principles here that were so widely read during the Revolution, the most dangerous thing to freedom is to acquiesce to something or to support something because you think it's not too terrible. He said, "Nothing is wanted at home but a precedent, the force of which shall be established by the tacit submission of the colonies." Samuel Adams had a very similar take. In 1771, one of his Candidus letters in the Boston Gazette, this is December 9th, 1771, he said, "If the liberties of America are ever completely ruined, of which in my opinion there is now the utmost danger, it will in all probability be the consequence of a mistaken notion of prudence, which leads men to acquiesce in measures of the most destructive tendency for the sake of present ease." Oh, yeah, well, we can't stick our necks out on this. We can't oppose this. There's too many other things to oppose. Well, Samuel Adams, father of the American Revolution, John Dickinson, Thomas Jefferson, James Otis, I can go through the list. They all told us that if you acquiesce, you quietly submit to these small things, you should not be surprised if you get more and more and more. And he went further. Of course, in this letter in 1771, he keeps highlighting the farmer, John Dickinson. He calls him the farmer from Pennsylvania. And he said, "Custom," says the farmer, "gradually reconciles us to objects even of dread and detestation. It reigns in nothing more arbitrarily than in public affairs. But when an act injurious to freedom has once been done, and the people bear it, the repetition of it is more likely to meet with submission." So if you don't stand firm, obsta principiis, if you don't oppose a disease at the beginning, then you will always see that disease get worse. Like a cancer, John Adams put it, acts against the Constitution, usurpations tend to grow faster and faster every hour, and eventually they consume you completely. Here's Samuel Adams again. "For as the mischief of the one was found to be tolerable, they will hope that the second will prove so too, and they will not regard the infamy of the last, because they are stained with that of the first." I think James Otis Jr. sums it up best here. And this is in that same letter or essay as Freeborn American in 1767. He said, "There is nothing, however, that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges." Now, again, I know it is impossible to spend our time opposing every single thing that the government does. We don't have enough hours in the day. But they are violating the Constitution constantly. So we take the position that it's not enough to just quietly acquiesce. It's not enough. And it's also much worse to actively support the lesser of two evils because of these principles that the founders taught us that we haven't learned in government-run schools, because government-run schools don't want to tell us about the dangers of government. So we're all propagandized, but somehow we have to learn. And here's how we put it over on X the other day. To be clear, we understand that, follow us at 10th Amendment all spelled out. To be clear, while we understand that the largest government in history does so much every single day that it's impossible to actively resist or oppose everything they do. However, actively supporting any of their unconstitutional programs because they don't seem too bad or are the, quote, least offensive is incredibly dangerous. And in many ways, this is exactly how we ended up with the biggest government in history. And I think the people who take this position are to the, I don't know if it's left or right or up and down, but they're more towards the statist side of things than even Alexander Hamilton was. Here he is in 1774 describing the problem with the British. He said, "What then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? What can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of our contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3d duty upon tea?" So he's talking about the Tea Act and then the following response to the coercive acts, which was the non-importation agreement and the Continental Association. And he's defending this, saying, like, look, it's not just this 3d tax on tea. There's an underlying issue here. And if we just look at the underlying issue, of course, we're going to resist it. He said, "The Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous, then, is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3d a pound on tea when it is evidently the principle against which we contend." So even Alexander Hamilton is saying you don't fight over how they're spending or how what amount that they're doing or what's the lesser of two evils. You have to look at the root problem. That is the principle of government doing stuff that they're not supposed to do. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Absolutely nothing helps us get this kind of original, foundational information, essential foundational principles from the founders and old revolutionaries out to more and more people, more than the financial faith and support of our members. I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members, and you can join them as well and us for as little as $2 a month if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they want to steal from you and hand out to other people to make them dependent on them. Throw it our way. We will use it. We punch way above our weight class. That's what Edward Snowden's attorney told me and Mike Meharry some years ago, so that was pretty cool, and I love thinking about it that way because we really do. This is a David versus Goliath thing when we're talking about individuals working from home, connecting with other people to stand for the Constitution and liberty when the government doesn't want us to do so. Anyways, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And just a few people that I want to say thank you to. William in New Jersey. There's Rob in Arizona. Suzanne in Florida. Carol in Pennsylvania. David in Texas. And Narveen in California. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for watching the show. I really appreciate you being here. Please consider the membership program. Otherwise, leaving comments or also leaving comments in the archive, smashing the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. All those things can help trigger algorithms and get the show out to at least a few more people. And every single person, break by break, person by person, state by state, this is how we expand the knowledge and the backbone to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty. Anyways, I appreciate you being here. I hope you had an awesome weekend. Hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.